Most people think they understand karma. Do something bad comes back to you. Cheat someone, you'll be cheated. Hurt someone, life will hurt you back. A kind of cosmic revenge system, a spiritual boomerang. The universe apparently keeping receipts. But that may not be what karma is at all, because beneath the pop culture version, beneath the memes, the one liners, and the social media declarations that quote unquote karma will get them, there exists a far older and far more profound idea. In the ancient traditions where the concept began, karma was never simply about punishment. And in the Law of One, karma is described in a way even more unusual, not as judgment, not as vengeance, not as divine retaliation, but as inertia, a force set into motion that continues moving until something stops it. And according to Ra, most people spend their lives mistaking that momentum for punishment, as though the universe were keeping score, as though suffering were some kind of sentence. But what if karma is not retribution at all? What if it is simply imbalance seeking balance? Energy left unresolved, action left uncorrected, lessons left unlearned. Not a judge, not a jailer, just consequence, continuing forward until a pattern is finally broken. Which raises a deeper question. If karma is momentum, what exactly has the power to stop it? The word karma comes from the ancient Sanskrit term karman, a word that, in its most literal form, simply means action, deed, or work. And that may sound almost disappointingly ordinary, because for many modern people, karma means something mystical, an invisible cosmic force keeping score of every moral success and failure. But historically, that is not how the concept began. The earliest known appearances of the word are found in the Vedic texts of ancient India, particularly the Rig Veda, one of the oldest surviving religious texts in human history, composed roughly between 1500 and 1200 BC. And in those earliest writings, karma did not primarily refer to morality. It referred to ritual action. Specifically, the sacred acts, sacrifices, chants, and ceremonial duties performed by Vedic priests to maintain harmony between humanity and the gods. In other words, the earliest use of karma was less about ethics and more about ritual precision. Do the right correctly, and the cosmos remain ordered. Do it incorrectly, and things may go poorly. Ancient spirituality was, at times, alarmingly procedural. But over the centuries, Indian religious thought began to evolve. And with it, so did the meaning of karma. By the time of the Upanishads, philosophical texts composed roughly between 800 and 300 BC, the concept had expanded dramatically. Karma was no longer merely ritual action, it had become moralized, ethicized, internalized, no longer simply, what ceremony did you perform, but rather, how did you live? One of the earliest and clearest expressions of this shift appears in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which states, a man turns into something good by good action, and into something bad by bad action. This was a major philosophical development because, for perhaps the first time, karma was being framed not merely as ritual consequence, but as moral causation. The universe, in this view, was not only responsive to sacred ceremony, it was responsive to human behavior itself. And from there, the doctrine spread and evolved through multiple Indian traditions. In Hinduism, karma became simply tied to the cycle of samsara, the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. One's present circumstances were understood, at least in part, as a result of past actions, whether from this life or previous incarnations. Every choice became consequential, every act a seed, every life partly the harvest of what had been planted before. Then came Buddhism, which inherited the concept but refined it further. In Buddhist thought, karma is not merely action, it is intentional action. The Buddha emphasized that karma arises specifically through volition, through what one consciously chooses to think, say, and do. This shifted karma away from a simplistic good deeds, bad deeds framework and towards something more psychological, a system in which repeated intention shapes consciousness itself. In effect, you become what you repeatedly choose, not because the universe is punishing you, but because habits of thought and action gradually construct the person you are. Then in Jainism, the doctrine became more radical still. Jains taught that karma is not merely metaphorical, but almost substantial, a kind of subtle material residue that literally adheres to the soul through harmful thoughts and actions. In that framework, every cruelty, every deception, every attachment accumulates as spiritual weight, binding the soul to further incarnation until purified away. Different traditions, different metaphysics, But despite their differences, they all converged on a shared principle that actions matter, that intention matters, that what we do does not vanish the moment it is done. It continues, it echoes, it shapes. And over time, as these ideas traveled west and filtered into modern culture, much of that nuance was lost. Karma became simplified, flattened into a slogan, reduced to bumper sticker spirituality. Good vibes only. What goes around comes around. Karma will get them. Which, to be fair, is emotionally satisfying. But that modern version, the idea of karma as cosmic revenge, is not how the ancient traditions understood it. And it is certainly not how the Law of One describes it. Because when Ra discusses karma, the language becomes far less moralistic, far less sentimental, far more mechanical. Not divine punishment, not celestial justice, just momentum. When the Law of One addresses karma directly, it does something rather unusual. It strips away nearly all of the moral language that people typically attach to the concept. No mention of divine punishment, no cosmic courtroom, no celestial scorekeeper tallying up your mistakes. Instead, Ra offers a definition that is almost startling in its simplicity. In session 34.4, when asked to define karma, Ra responds, our understanding of karma is that which may be called inertia. Those actions which are put into motion will continue, using the ways of balancing until such time as a controlling or a higher principle which you may liken unto your braking or stopping is invoked. Inertia, a word borrowed from physics, the tendency of a moving object to continue moving unless acted upon by another force, which immediately changes the emotional texture of the concept. Because inertia is not personal. It does not hate you, it does not judge you, it doesn't care. A rolling boulder is not punishing the person downhill, it is simply continuing in the direction it was set. And according to this model, so do actions, so do distortions, so do unresolved imbalances within consciousness itself. What we call karma, then, is not some mystical punishment system, but the continued motion of energetic imbalance through time and experience. Or stated more plainly, when consciousness creates distortion through harmful action, disharmony, manipulation, cruelty, or unresolved conflict, that imbalance remains active until balance is restored. Not because the universe is mad at you, but because imbalance, by its nature, seeks correction. Just as a body seeks equilibrium, just as water seeks level, just as a bent branch stores tension until it either snaps or straightens. And notably, Ra does not frame karma as something externally imposed. This is critical. The balancing process is not described as a punishment inflicted upon the soul. It is described more like a consequence arising within the soul, a self created momentum which aligns with one of the Law of One's broader themes that the universe is not fundamentally punitive, it is reflective, catalytic, responsive. You are not being judged by some external authority. You are experiencing the natural consequences of the distortions you yourself has set into motion. And if that's true, then karma may have less to do with quote unquote bad things happening to bad people and more to do with consciousness encountering the unfinished consequences of its own imbalance, which would explain why karmic patterns often seem repetitive, why certain lessons keep returning, why people appear to meet the same type of suffering, the same relational dynamics, the same internal conflicts again and again. Not because life is cruel, not because fate is mocking them, but perhaps because momentum continues until balance is reached. The universe apparently believes in remedial coursework. And this is where the Law of One's view begins to diverge sharply from simplistic ideas of cosmic justice. Because karma in this model is not fundamentally about suffering. Suffering may accompany it, often does, but suffering itself is not the mechanism. Pain does not automatically erase karma. Time does not automatically erase karma. Even repeated hardship does not necessarily erase karma. Because if suffering alone resolved imbalance, then humanity would be the most enlightened species in the galaxy by now. Clearly, that has not happened. So, if karma is inertia, and if suffering alone does not stop it, then what is the higher principle Ra says can halt the momentum of action? That answer, according to the Law of One, is where the concept becomes far more radical than many realize. According to Ra, there is one force capable of stopping karmic momentum, and it is not punishment, not suffering, not penance, not time. It is forgiveness. In the same answer in session 34.4, immediately after defining karma as inertia, Ross states, This stoppage of inertia of action may be called forgiveness. These two concepts are inseparable. Inseparable, meaning karma and forgiveness are not merely related, they are functionally intertwined. One creates momentum, the other ends it. And if that's true, then forgiveness is not simply a moral nicety. It is not mere politeness, not weakness, not passivity, not pretending harm did not occur. It is an act of profound metaphysical consequence. Because to forgive, truly forgive, is to stop carrying forward the momentum of injury, to refuse to perpetuate it, to decline to let pain replicate itself through you. And that may be one of the most difficult things a human being can do, because pain has a way of demanding continuation. When we are wounded, something in us often wants balance, but not the kind Ra describes. We want repayment, vindication, justice. We want the other person to hurt as we hurt. We want them to understand what they did. And if they never do, if they never apologize, never regret it, never acknowledge the damage, forgiveness can feel almost offensive, like surrender, like letting them get away with it. But the law of one's implication is that forgiveness is not primarily for them, it is for the one still carrying the wound. Because resentment is its own form of bondage. Hatred binds, bitterness binds. The refusal to release injury ties consciousness to the very thing it claims to want freedom from. And so forgiveness in this view is not the denial of wrongdoing, it is the refusal to remain spiritually chained to it. It is saying, yes, harm occurred. Yes, pain was real. Yes, injustice may have been done. But I will not carry this further. I will not become its extension. I will not let this pain write the rest of my story. And perhaps even more difficult, Ra makes clear that forgiveness must extend not only outward, but inward. Because in session 18.12, Ra states, forgiveness of other self is forgiveness of self. An understanding of this insists upon full forgiveness upon the conscious level of self and other self, for they are one. A full forgiveness is thus impossible without the inclusion of self. This may be the more difficult half of the teaching, because many people find it easier to forgive others than to forgive themselves, to excuse the failures of friends, yet internally prosecute themselves without mercy, to carry old shame for years, sometimes decades, replaying mistakes long after the moment has passed, punishing themselves internally again and again and again, as though endless self condemnation could somehow rewrite history. Spoiler alert, it can't. But if Ra is correct, then refusing to forgive oneself may be one of the most powerful ways to keep karmic momentum active. Because guilt, when transformed into honest reflection, can be useful. It can teach, it can humble, it can redirect. But guilt that calcifies into shame, into identity, becomes another prison. At some point, growth requires a person to acknowledge what they have done, learn from it, make amends where possible, and then release the whip. Not because the mistake was acceptable, not because the harm did not matter, but because endless self punishment does not heal distortion, it perpetuates it. And perhaps this is the deeper lesson hidden beneath the law of one's teaching, that forgiveness is not simply how karma ends, it is how consciousness chooses healing over perpetuation, how it chooses understanding over retaliation, how it chooses evolution over repetition. And in a world that increasingly rewards outrage, resentment, public humiliation, and permanent moral condemnation, that may be one of the most radical acts left available to us. One challenge in discussing karma through the Law of One is that Ra does not spend a tremendous amount of time cataloging specific karmic examples. There is no exhaustive list of who did what and what metaphysical consequence followed, conveniently denying us the cosmic spreadsheet many people seem to want. But scattered throughout the material are several glimpses into how Ra says karmic balancing can actually manifest. And those examples help reveal what karma looks like when viewed through this framework. One of the clearest discussions comes when Ra describes what occurred to the entities of Maldek. They had so much karmic restitution to go through that it took eons to achieve. You can learn more about this in a previous episode about the entities of Mars and Maldek. Ra then explains that karma develops when an entity becomes conscious enough to understand responsibility for its actions. This is important because it suggests karma is not simply attached to every mistake automatically. Karma requires awareness, responsibility, the capacity to understand that one's choices affects others. A child may act harmfully without full comprehension. An animal may kill without moral implication. But once consciousness develops to the point where it knows what it's doing, the stakes change. Choice gains metaphysical weight. And in session 18.7, Ross says this occurs around the age of 15 months to humans. An entity incarnating upon the earth plane becomes conscious of self at a varying point in its time space progress through the continuum. This may have a medium, shall we say, of approximately 15 of your months. Some entities become conscious of the self at a period closer to incarnation, some at a period farther from this event. In all cases, responsibility then becomes retroactive from that point backwards in the continuum so that distortions are to be understood by the entity and dissolved as the entity learns. Ra also suggests that karmic balancing can influence incarnation planning itself. Before incarnation, the soul may choose circumstances designed to balance prior distortions. Difficult relationships, loss, limitation, vulnerability, powerlessness, not as punishment, but as opportunities to experience the opposite side of prior imbalance. To understand directly what was once inflicted indirectly. This does not mean every hardship is karmic punishment. That would be both simplistic and frankly dangerous. The law of one repeatedly emphasizes that catalyst serves many functions: growth, polarization, learning, randomness within incarnation, collective planetary circumstance. Not every suffering is karmic repayment, but some suffering may be consciously chosen by the soul as balancing catalyst. Perhaps the most striking example Ra gives comes when discussing those who have abused power. Ra implies that one who has dominated, controlled, or deprived others of freedom may later choose circumstances of limitation or subjugation to understand that distortion from the opposite perspective. Not because they are being made to suffer, but because direct experience can produce understanding that theory alone cannot. A consciousness that has caused pain may eventually seek to know pain. A consciousness that has withheld compassion may eventually seek circumstances that teach dependence upon compassion. And if that sounds severe, it may be worth remembering. In the law of one's framework, these choices are not imposed by an angry deity. They are chosen by the higher self, chosen by the soul itself, which is perhaps a more unsettling idea, because it means the architect of many painful lessons may not be some external judge, but the deeper part of you that values growth more than comfort. Your higher self, apparently, is not always concerned with your preference for easy mode. And that perhaps is the most important implication of all this, that karmic balancing is not vindictive. It is educational. Its aim is not pain. Its aim is understanding, not retribution, but integration, to bring consciousness into full awareness of the effects of what it has created. Until eventually, through enough understanding, enough compassion, enough forgiveness, the pattern no longer needs to repeat. Because once the lesson is fully learned, momentum has no further reason to continue. So, if the law of one is correct, then karma is not a punishment system. It is not divine vengeance, not cosmic revenge, not the universe keeping score of who has been naughty and nice. It is simply momentum, the continued movement of imbalance through consciousness until balance is restored. And if that's true, then perhaps the real lesson of karma has never been about fear. Not behave or the universe will get you, but rather be mindful because what you create continues. Every cruelty continues. Every kindness continues. Every resentment continues. Every act of mercy continues. What we set in motion does not simply disappear because the moment has passed. It echoes, sometimes through others, sometimes through ourselves, sometimes through years or lifetimes. And according to Ra, the force that stops that momentum is not suffering, not punishment, not vengeance. It is forgiveness, which may make forgiveness one of the most powerful acts available to a human being. To forgive another is to refuse to perpetuate pain, to decline to let injury replicate itself through your own thoughts, your own speech, your own behavior. To say, the harm stops here, and to forgive yourself, truly forgive yourself, may be harder still because many people live as though permanent self condemnation is a form of virtue, as though never letting themselves forget is somehow noble, as though endless shame proves moral seriousness. But shame rarely transforms, it usually paralyzes. And there comes a point where growth requires more than guilt. It requires honesty, it requires responsibility, it requires making amends where possible, and then it requires release. Because if you have learned, if you have changed, if you understand now what you once did not, then continued self punishment serves no purpose except continuation of the wound. The law of one's view, then, is not merely that forgiveness is helpful, it is that forgiveness is liberating, spiritually, psychologically, relationally. It frees the one forgiven, it frees the one forgiving, it frees the self from the prison of endless repetition. And perhaps that is why forgiveness feels so difficult. Because true forgiveness requires strength, it requires humility, it requires relinquishing the strange comfort of righteous anger. It requires choosing healing over vindication, understanding over retaliation, peace over the temporary satisfaction of hatred. And in a world increasingly built on outrage, where every mistake is archived, every offense immortalized, and mercy often mistaken for weakness, forgiveness may be one of the most rebellious acts a person can commit. Because to forgive is to declare, I will not become the continuation of this pain. And perhaps, if there is any practical lesson to take from the idea of karma, it is this: be careful what you set in motion, and when possible, forgive. Forgive others for their ignorance. Forgive yourself for the person you were before you knew better. Because if Ra is right, forgiveness is not merely kindness, it is how suffering stops traveling. Thank you for watching or listening. I wish you all love, light, peace, and joy. Take care.